Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. We'll just give it another 30 seconds or so and let a few more participants filter in, and then we'll formally start the webinar. But thank you again for joining us today, and we'll get started just in a moment. All right. Well, given time is upon us, it's just past 10:30. We will get started now, and I'm sure a few more people will join us over the course of the next few minutes. But welcome and thank you for joining us for the launch of our Atlas of Australia Online 2023 report. I'm Sophie Mitchell, and I'm auDA's Chief Communications Officer. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming to you from today. I'm down in Melbourne, the original home of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first people to innovate and use technology on this land, and to do so over many millennia, a knowledge upon which we at auDA and in the auDA community build upon today. I'd also like to just point out that this session is being recorded today. And so with that, the formalities being over, I'd also like to soon introduce Rosemary Sinclair, auDA's CEO, who introduced our new research report that's been commissioned by auDA. We also have with us today Professor Paul McCarthy, auDA's lead research partner in the report, who will take us through the methodology and key findings. Following the presentation, Paul and Rosemary will also take questions from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Zoom Q&A tab at any time throughout the session. And then when we come to it at the end, we'll read them out. All right, and with that, I will now hand over to Rosemary Sinclair. Thanks, Rosemary.
Thanks, Sophie, and welcome everybody. Let me just give you a bit of context for this important piece of research. It relates to one of our strategic focus areas, that of innovation. And in that area, what we're aiming to do is to use our data and resources, but in collaboration with expert partners, to deliver leading insights related to the .au and the utility of the internet. Today is one example of this shared work, and it adds to a suite of research that you can find on our website, including our Digital Lives of Australians series, which looks into the benefits Australians get from the internet, but also, importantly, the online challenges they face. This year, that particular report took a close look at emerging technology in particular. We also have our Why.au report, which sets out the value that the .au delivers to Australian individuals and businesses. And we're pleased to add to this report suite with an exciting piece of new research developed in collaboration with the League of Scholars and researchers from CSIRO's Data 61 and the University of Technology, Sydney. And that is the Atlas of Australia Online 2023. The report augments our own .au registry data provided by auDA with a range of publicly available data sets. And as Paul will set out shortly, this includes geographic, economic, and technical data. The result is an amazingly interesting contemporary atlas of the Australian internet, and it reveals significant insights into the digital landscape of Australia. Importantly, the work sets out how domain name registrations are in fact a leading indicator of innovation and broader economic activity. The findings complement the other work by auDA, and we hope together will provide decision makers with new insights for policy considerations and researchers with new avenues for further work. I'm particularly excited about the possibilities for future collaborations that have sprung forth from this report. And while the research relates to insights about .au, we really hope that the methodology can be applied and used outside of Australia, whether among our Pacific partners in their own digital transformation journeys or further afield, all of which is designed to support innovation and economic and social value creation. We welcome your thoughts and feedback during and after the webinar, and I really look forward to hearing from you. And with that little taste test, let me introduce our lead research partner who will present today's findings. Professor Paul McCarthy is an adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, an industry fellow at the Data Science Institute at UTS, and an honorary fellow at Western Sydney University. Paul is also CEO and co-founder of League of Scholars, a startup using AI and data science to map the research landscape worldwide. Thanks so much for your efforts with the report, Paul, and for joining us today. Let me hand over to you now to take us through the research, after which Paul and I will be delighted to take your questions. Paul, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Rosemary, for that kind intro. Fabulous. Can everyone see the screen I'm presenting? I presume they can. Good. Yeah, it was our pleasure to work on this project, Rosemary, with you, and I'll give a bit of an overview now, and we can then have an opportunity for some questions. So this brief overview will talk a bit about what the project was about, what the purpose was, how we went about the design of the research, what the key findings were, and what this might mean for the future. League of Scholars is a specialist data science research firm, and this work was done in collaboration with colleagues from UTS and CSIRO's Data 61. Some of the other work we do is in the kind of research mapping space. We do a who's who of Australian research with the Australian newspaper each year. We also work with Springer Nature in London to help map the research landscape worldwide. The purpose of this report was to try and understand the .au, what can we learn from the .au space that can tell us not only about the technology landscape in Australia, but also about patterns in the broader economy and society. The central idea with this is that the web tells us lots about the broader economy, and linking what we call structural features in a technical sense, so features related to the web itself, to non-structural features. In other words, features of the economy and society more broadly. Some of the questions we posed as part of this research was, does domain name registration correlate or predict other economic factors? And what are the patterns in the domain space and related technologies? What can we learn from the technology footprint as revealed through the .au domain space? So our starting point for this research was to create a reference data set. We started with the full set of .au domain registrations, of which there are over 4 million across the different subdomains. And we looked at various facets within those domains. So we looked at traffic, which many people would be familiar with, the number of visitors and page views that each of these domains receive, also their scale, the number of pages within each domain. But one of the key concepts is this idea of network centrality. So trying to understand the geometry of the Australian web and how the network graph kind of sits, and how domains sit in relation to other domains. This is, of course, central to web search technology, and network centrality is one axis on which most web search algorithms are built. So that gives you a kind of sense of authority, the authority of websites, and the relevance of the two dimensions on which web search, including Google search, is based. And using these three types of features, we developed a reference data set of 100,000 domains in the .au space. This included .com.au, .gov.au, .org.au, as well as .au direct websites, and it's a large and comprehensive sample of the Australian web. Just to explain a bit more detail as to why network centrality matters, that's probably the least familiar of those three measures for people. And again, it's because network centrality has been shown through research and through research that we're doing on an ongoing basis, that it relates not just to technical features, in other words, features of the network or the graph, the web graph itself, like, for example, the number of inbound link counts, the domain size and web traffic volumes, but also non-structural features. In other words, it relates to features of the organisations, whether they be government agencies or companies or not-for-profits, but they're the features of the organisations underlying the domains themselves. Here is a snapshot of the top 100 websites included in the 100K, and you can delve into this in a bit more detail with the report. We found that the 100K was representative of a broader range of websites. So it's a large and representative sample of the Australian web and includes most of the websites that, most of the leading websites in Australia. What we then did was we took this kind of reference sample, the 100K, and we linked it to a range of social and economic data from the ABS, from ASIC, from IP Australia. We also linked it to web search data with Google. We looked at various measures of web traffic, and another interesting source, which was technology usage within the websites using a source known as built with, a commercial source. So this augmented data enabled us to explore some of these patterns and what can be revealed. We did this in three main themes. The first was this geographic lens, looking at the spatial dimension. So in other words, we looked at domain registration by postcode in Australia, and we found that, unsurprisingly, the number of businesses in a postcode related to the number of domains, and there's a very high correlation, nearly 90% correlation between the number of businesses registered in a postcode and the number of domains. But what was more interesting is when you divide the number of domains in a geographic area or a postcode, there's still this variation. You still get a variation in the number of domains registered. And we call this the digital business intensity. So it's an adjusted new measure of understanding the relative digital business intensity by location. So then we went further and we wanted to try and explore, well, what does the variations, the geographic variation in digital business intensity, what are the other kind of factors that are associated with that? And one of them we looked at was an idea of remoteness. So remoteness is a measure of an established economic measure in Australia. There are a couple of key remoteness scales, and we looked at remoteness and we found that, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the more urban a centre, the more domains are registered. But perhaps what's interesting about this is also the outliers. So you see outliers in regional and remote areas that have high digital business intensity. And I guess understanding what we can learn from this is what have these kind of centres, towns done to promote digital intensity, and what can we learn from that in terms of reducing the digital divide across Australia. Here you can see some correlations. So this is showing that the RA index and the M index, which are two different standardised measures of remoteness and regionality in Australia, both statistically significantly correlated to domains per capita registered, but also even when adjusting for population, so taking into account that population still. We also found, we looked at a variety of socioeconomic indices that the ABS produce. That looks at levels of education, types of occupations that people are in, indices of social advantage and disadvantage. And we found that education and occupation was strongly correlated, was one of the 4 strongly correlated indices to domain name registration. So in other words, if you live in a postcode that has high levels of education, you're more likely to have more domains registered in that area. These are the correlations. You can see statistical significance across all 4 of these ABS indices. And again, just illustrating that there is a digital divide, which is real and can be measured, and progress in terms of improving that government and policymakers can be measured. The next sort of frame in which we looked at this space was looking at a time-based analysis, or temporal analysis. So here we're looking at domain registrations over time. And we looked at how do they correlate to other business and IP registrations. We found that there was strong correlations between domain name registrations as well as business registrations, patent registrations, and trademark registrations, all 3. But what is really interesting with this is we used an approach known as Granger correlation analysis, which looks at the time shifting. So these were correlated but time shifted, and we found that domain registrations were coincident with business registrations. So in other words, people register a domain and then they often register a business at the same time. That's perhaps not surprising. But then there's a kind of a slight lag where they might register a trademark and then later a patent. So it's telling us that domain registration is the first action in a cycle and is can be shown to be a leading economic indicator and might be useful for a whole range of other economic prediction activities. The last frame that we looked at the data through was through a technology lens. So this is using the technology footprint of all the domains themselves in the reference data set. So we looked at the 100K Australian websites and we looked at the detailed technology usage patterns within each of these websites. We used a source known as Built With, which is an Australian innovative business that keeps archival data about website technology usage worldwide. They're a global business but based here in Australia, and they keep data on over 13,000 technology categories. So there's quite a detailed footprint for each website and what technology it uses. And we used machine learning to cluster the websites in Australia in terms of similar patterns of usage. And we found that 11 tech tribes emerged. In other words, groups of organisations as represented through their domains that shared common patterns of technology usage. And then we found that by looking at this is a two-dimensional representation of this map. You can see here custom CMSs was one of the biggest categories, those characterized by the use of advanced JavaScript, 2 different types of hosted CMSs, e-commerce sites in 2 different flavors, and so on. And the interesting thing is that when you dive into each of these clusters, there are also associated other patterns. So, for example, some of these relate to patterns, offline patterns. For example, 3 clusters were associated with higher revenue organisations, organisations that had higher revenues. 2 of them were associated with larger companies as measured by headcount. And so on. So, and you can see some of them were associated with newer domains, more recently registered domains, and some are associated with older domains. So, I mean, we're just beginning to lift the lid on this, but you can sort of see that this is a really interesting kind of new window into economic activity through the lens of the .au space. here we looked at trying to understand and delve into a little bit more each of these clusters from a functional point of view, looking at the technologies themselves. You can see that these first two, for example, were both platform content management systems, signature technologies. In other words, technologies that websites in these clusters are more likely to use include Wix and Squarespace. And then we found that Wix was used more frequently by NGOs. Squarespace was associated with businesses that had higher revenue. These details are all in the report, so you can delve into this in a bit more detail. This is another bit more technical look at the functional division of the 100K through the lens of their tech footprints. Here we've got 29 functional categories of technology usage. So, for example, SSL is a security technology, you can see here. And these numbers here represent the reveal comparative advantage of each of the subdomain spaces and their relative use of these technologies. So, for example, you can see .edu.au is 8% more likely to use technologies with a media flavour than the .au space as a whole, and so on. You can see secure CDNs are used by government. It's characteristic. So you get a sense of these types of the functional characteristics of the different domain spaces. And one last piece is we looked at the .au space as a whole. So while you can dive down into individual domains, learn more about the organisations and the technology footprints of those at an organisation level, you can also look at the .au space as a whole on the global stage and compare with other top-level country domains, for example. And we found that on a network centrality basis, we found that Australia's web is among the most central in the world in terms of top-level domain, and it ranks 6th in network centrality as measured by harmonic centrality. What does this mean? What's the significance of this? It just means that Australia is a trusted source of information, of commerce in the web, and it's central to the global web. We're doing a bit more in this space, and we've got a research paper in consideration for a global conference, Web Science Conference, in Europe next year, which delves into this kind of area a bit more for those that are interested. And that's it. So hopefully you've learned something and it's given you a bit of a taste of this report, and we welcome any questions.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that great summary of the report. And I think we've dropped a copy of the report into the chat as well. So for those people who haven't managed to find it yet on auDA's website, you can easily access it there and take away take it away, have a read, and get a much deeper analysis there as well. But we do have a few questions from the audience, so I will put them to you, Paul, and perhaps some of them are for Rosemary as well. So I'll just kick off with the first question here. And this is from Patrick Miles, who asks, will a methodology document be made available for other interested CCTLD operators around the world? So that's country code top-level domain name operators around the world, for those who aren't familiar with that acronym. Paul?
Yes, I believe the methodology should be explained in the detail of the report, and there's a lot of endnotes. Hopefully that will provide enough detail for people wanting to reproduce that. But anyone who's interested in reproducing the results or doing a similar thing with another domain space, most welcome to contact us directly, and we can give them more guidance.
Fabulous. Thanks, Paul. And then I have another question, and this question is from Bruce, and it goes to the issue of network centrality, which is, of course, features in the report. And he asks, why is it, Paul, that Costa Rica had strong network centrality when compared to Australia and other developed nations? I'm just wondering if you had any further insights you could add to that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Bruce, and it struck us as unusual when we saw it come up initially. I think it's one surprising thing I learned about Costa Rica is it's an oasis of trust within Central America, and it is among the most trusted. It is the most trusted, I think, global country in that region, so it comes perhaps as no surprise that there's a relationship there between its centrality. Its network centrality. And these centrality measures are not scale dependent. So one of the things that's quite interesting is it doesn't necessarily favour bigger countries. So you do get these smaller countries like Iceland and Costa Rica kind of on a level playing field. It's really about what does the world think collectively about the most trusted sources of information.
Thanks, Paul. And look, you've perhaps touched on it. You certainly touched on it in brief in your presentation, and you've just touched on it again there. And of course, there is a more fulsome explanation in the report document itself. But just for those who are attending online today, somebody has asked if you could just please give a quick recap of the meaning of network centrality and also harmonic centrality, just for those of us playing at home who aren't as familiar with these terms. That'd be really helpful. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, well, a simple way to explain it is you measure the distance. If you want to measure, you can measure it at a country level or at an organisation level. At an organisation level, if you think about one domain, say your domain for your organisation, if you want to measure the network centrality, you measure the distance between your domain and every other domain on the web, the entire web. And then you work out the shortest. You do the average of those, and then that gives you a sense of how central it is. So if you are in the center of the web, the distances are shorter than those on the periphery of the web, as you can imagine. If you're on the periphery of the web, then all the distances are large, relatively speaking, and you have to traverse the whole web to get the distances. And distance in this sense is measured by number of hops in terms of links. So so those are the two concepts you need to understand. One is it's number of distance in terms of links. So it's a kind of a network graph measure of distance. And it's an oversimplified version of the measure is, there is a formula in the report, but an oversimplified measure is it's just simply just the measure of distance between your domain and every other domain on the web and how central it is. So that's network centrality in general, and then harmonic centrality is one particular instance of that. And one of the nice things about it, unlike PageRank is another measure of network centrality, and that's the one, of course, that's famously used by Google to rank websites, is that because it's less open to manipulation. There's less incentives at the moment to artificially inflate harmonic centrality. So it does have some benefits in terms of its use as a measure of centrality.
Right. Thanks, Paul. I hope that was helpful. But again, there is also a really good explanation in the report itself. So certainly encourage people to take a look at that. And Paul, we just had another question from Rohan on the line, and he asks about the digital divide between regional and urban Australia. And whether, and perhaps this is a question for Rosemary as well, but the question really relates to how it can be bridged. I guess in the context of the report, do we think it gives any indications? So, and the question gets quite detailed, but asks about whether it's should be a government effort. So you might like to throw that one to Rosemary, Paul.
I've got some thoughts, but Rosemary, do you want to?
Why don't you start, Paul, and then I'll happily take the baton.
Okay, cool. I mean, it is definitely a question for government. My sense, though, is that if we're advising government on this, I would suggest that it's a specialisation clearly works. We can see that regional towns that have a clear functional purpose that distinguishes them from others, like, for example, whether that's tourism, whether that's sea change, whether that's mining, these towns that have a clear identity and a kind of a connection to a national purpose and distinguish themselves. It seems to be one of the factors that's emerging as a associated with high digital business intensity. So, I mean, it's kind of that's one thought. Yeah.
Pardon me. Yeah, if I could just pick up on that point. I think for me, what comes out of the report on digital divide is that to be successful in reducing the digital divide, we've got to have a combination of the base connectivity. So all the work that has been done on making NBN services available to regional communities, that's step one. Then what is coming out of the research to me is that success in terms of creating economic and social value in and for those communities depends on policies which support uptake and use and understanding. So it's the combination of the connectivity, the policy focus around innovation, with domain names being part of that response, and then focus on the economic and social outcomes. It's that more complex combination comes out from the report to me. It's not just a matter of putting a mobile tower in a regional community and thinking job done. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks, Rosemary.
There's one other thing I was going to just add on that is that I guess this provides a new toolkit for measuring any policy intervention. That's one of the things. I mean, I wouldn't presume to be an expert in any of these policy areas, but it does offer policymakers a new way of kind of measuring before and after. So, if you're going to make a series of interventions, then let's have a look at did it have an impact? Which ones were most successful? And we can really, I think, learn a lot. All of us can learn a lot from these new tools.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Rosemary. Paul, I also have another question from you. Somebody is just asking about the .au top 100,000 that you referenced in your presentation. It also features, of course, in the report. And they just asked, or they note that there's smaller websites doubtless have a story to tell as well, and will be just as important to the .au. And so the question is whether or not we considered or might do in the future research on those websites outside of the top 100,000. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point, Sophie. And yes, that's certainly something to consider. It's worth noting also that the 100,000 does include a number of smaller websites. Like as we get down the list, it is very asymmetric, that top 100,000. So yes, there are a lot of small websites included, but I think the point is well made that we are open to doing more with the much smaller websites as well. Absolutely.
Thanks, Paul. And Rosemary, of course, feel free to jump in at any point if you would like to add to those.
I wouldn't mind adding just briefly to that, Sophie, because it's a question that some ask, which is why would auDA bother doing this kind of research? Why are we interested? And of course, we're interested not only for our own reasons, but because we want to share the material. The answer to that question goes back quite a way, and it goes back to the early days of COVID, when we at auDA were watching the response to the economic catastrophe, as well as being a health catastrophe that COVID was. And we started to see existing small businesses that were very well established we started to see those businesses register domain names in surprisingly large numbers. They suddenly could see that a digital presence was going to be part of getting through COVID. And that the innovation, the rapid innovation and productivity uplift that we saw through watching domain names in that first 12 months of COVID really raised questions in our mind about the link between domain name registration, which is the first step, of course. There's much more involved in innovation than just registering the domain name. But the link between domain name registration and innovation and productivity was a story that we thought had not been told. And at that time, we were watching across postcodes and saw activity across postcodes, not just in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane. So, that's the early start of the questions, that led to this research. The second point that I'd like to make just about this point of small businesses, I would say micro businesses, is the very successful launch of .au Direct. When we have looked at that, what we have seen is an initiative that was some years in the making, but an initiative to launch a new namespace that again supports innovation in the economy, this time for very small micro businesses who for the first time can get access to a simple, short, direct name in .au. So that transformation of the Australian economy in the direction of entrepreneurship and a gig economy is something that we have been watching very closely through the launch of .au Direct. And again, it would be very interesting at a future point to do more research into that. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Rosemary. And certainly this isn't auDA's only area of research or area of endeavour in the research field as well. So I'm sure those who attend our webinars regularly are familiar with some of those other reports, and they're also on our website, and stay tuned for what comes down the pipeline next year. But with that little plug from me, back to questions. We've still got a few more moments. And Paul, one of the other questions relates to our previous discussion just about the top 100,000. And this question asks, is there anything that small organisations can learn from the top 100,000? Is there anything that the analysis tells us that would be of interest there, Paul?
Absolutely, yes. We can see, for example, one of the things I think that's very interesting is the tech usage patterns and this idea of tech tribes. So we can see that there are 11 different patterns of usage of technology among the top 100K websites in Australia, and you can see where you might fit and in that sort of scheme, and what lessons one might learn from the technology usage patterns of others. In future research, we've sort of identified one potential use case of this is identifying risk of for security risks. So sort of clear vulnerabilities might be associated with certain technology usage. So if, for example, you're using an older version of software among your tech stack, somehow that might be a known vulnerability, and that could provide clues for helping people sort of improve their cyber strength.
If I could just add briefly to that, Sophie, in support of that point that Paul has just made. The work that we do at auDA on DNS abuse cases takes us into the world of small business. And what we find in 70% of the cases is that there's a vulnerability related to out-of-date, unpatched software tools. So that's a very strong correlating message. I would say on the other side of that coin, the message that's coming to us from the top 100 in this research is the time and money spent in investing in a website and innovating is a really important part of being or having an effective presence, if you like, in the digital economy. So I think the findings of the research are certainly supporting our own experience at auDA. Thanks.
Thanks, Rosemary. And I think we're steaming towards the end of our time today, but I think we've got time for one last question, and it relates to language, Paul. So the report noted that one of the tech categories was language. And the question is just, is there a breakdown of the use of languages other than English as well, such as Chinese or other languages that may also be used in .au websites?
Not in this report, no, but that data is available potentially in future work, and certainly that data is available from the underlying data that we use to produce the research. So there is a possibility to do that language-based analysis in future, yes.
Fabulous. Thanks, Paul. And I think there might be time just for one more, Evan. So I'm just making a liar of myself. But just a very quick last question, which was just about whether or not the analysis looked at whether any of the domain names were registered by a proxy, so potentially by a registrar, for example, and whether that may have been taken into account in any of the analysis.
I think we did notice that there was certainly one of the tribes is associated with a larger number of parked websites. So I suspect that does reflect that some of them are registered by proxies. Yes. So we haven't dug into that issue specifically, so I'll have to take that on notice. But it's a really good question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Paul, and potentially an area for future endeavour. All right, thank you very much. That brings us almost to a close today. I just wanted to thank you, Paul, for your time today, and also, of course, to you and the team for all of your work in this fantastic report. And we certainly encourage everybody to download it and have a good read. Thank you also to Rosemary for making the time to join Paul and I today. And of course, thanks to our audience and for your questions and your engagement throughout this morning. Please, of course, stay engaged with auDA. We have, as I said, other research that's available on our website and certainly coming up into next year. Those who are already auDA members would know that you receive regular updates, and you're welcome to, of course, join us as an auDA member. All of the details are online. And for those who are members, we're, of course, getting together tomorrow night in Melbourne for our final member event of the year, which is just one of the many benefits of being an auDA member. So please come along if you haven't already registered. We look forward to seeing you at Stone and Chalk tomorrow evening. All right, that is it from me. So thank you again to Paul and Rosemary and to our audience. And we look forward to seeing you next time, which will be in 2024 at our next webinar. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.